So inflation is at 50-year highs all around the world today, and most Bitcoiners, gold bugs, and Austrians like myself would claim that it is 100% a result of the Federal Reserve, central bankers, and of course their outlandish money printing. But today I'm joined with Josh, who is obviously George Gammons' research assistant, who is going to make an argument for why we could all be looking at the wrong things. Josh, welcome to the CoinBeast YouTube channel.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I would have my Jeff Snyder poster behind me, but I'm in El Salvador with Luke, so sadly I couldn't bring him with me.
So today we're actually here in person here in El Salvador for a little bit of a debate that'll probably end up being a friendly discussion about money printing and Bitcoin, which will be actually a little bit of a post-mortem from a recent three-way debate that Josh, myself, and George Gammon had, which was obviously posted yesterday on the CoinBeast channel. So I'll slap a link for that video up on screen for the moment. But one of the topics that I thought we probably should focus a little bit more time on that we touched in that discussion with George Gammon was money printing. Like, we are all told that the inflation we're seeing manifest itself all around the world today is due to straight up money printing. And, you know, I am guilty of saying yes, it is the money printers causing the inflation, but Josh, who's with me today, thinks there could be some other factors contributing to that. So, Josh, what are your thoughts on QE, inflation, and money printing?
Yeah, so let's first break down how money is created, because when people throw these terms out, especially since the GFC, they think that bank reserves are just money printing. So let's go over the three ways that money is created. The first, I think, common conception is when banks lend, new dollars are created into existence. That's basically any dollars that are on the non-bank entities is what matters when you are trying to forecast inflation. A lot of people look at the bank's balance sheet, but the only thing that matters are the bank liabilities, aka me, you, and everyone watching's checking account or savings. So the first way is bank lending. The second way is government deficit spending. So when Janet Yellen comes out and issues new debt, and that is bought by banks or the Federal Reserve, and then the Treasury spends that into the economy, new dollars are now being pushed into the real economy, bringing M2 money supply up as well as inflation. The third way is a bit more complicated. We don't need to talk about it too much, but it is the selling of treasuries from non-bank entities. We'll kind of skip over that for now because it's not as applicable. But if me or you, we sell treasuries, our checking accounts get deposits with dollars, and M2 money supply actually rises. But what we are going to talk about is the misconceptions that the Fed has been creating money for so long, and that money creation is bad, because I don't think so. Me and Luke have been talking this whole time of a Bitcoin panacea world, and if it is bad to have money creation, because I would argue that it is not. So let's go back in time to the 1800s.
Before you go back in time, Josh, let's actually touch on that period of time just after 2008. Because I myself, if I had been interested in the Bitcoin space and, you know, the gold bug space, I would have thought that the expansion of the central bank balance sheet in 2008 and 2009 would have caused significant CPI inflation around the world. But earlier in that discussion that we had with George, you kind of pointed out to the fact that why did we not see inflation following the 08 GFC? Maybe it's worth just quickly touching on that before we jump into the 1800s.
Yeah, because we see bank reserves and we think, oh my God, the Fed is printing all this money with all these memes, Jerome Powell just dumping dollars on everyone. But that's not actually true, because what happens? What is the mechanism behind quantitative easing? The Federal Reserve is going to print quote unquote bank reserves, and they are going to buy treasuries from banks. That's all that's happening. So a bank has a bunch of treasuries on its balance sheet. The Fed comes along and buys those with bank reserves. So let's think that through. How, in any circumstance, is that ever going to cause new dollars being created? The banks, they're not going to the grocery store, jacking up the price of your eggs. No, that's the consumers. So what is quantitative easing really doing? You could argue in 2008 that it was taking the toxic assets off their balance sheet. But right now, who is to say that banks don't want those treasuries more than they want the reserves? And you can look at the yield curve right now, and there's a lot of data to suggest that the treasuries have an additional use case, which is a form of collateral in the repo market and in the Eurodollar system that has a much higher premium than bank reserves. So bank reserves, they just don't create dollars. And then the second argument was, well, yeah, QE doesn't directly create money, but what it does do is it frees up the bank's balance sheet so they can then create more loans. But the last time I checked, I've never heard of a bank saying, guys, we really can't make this loan because our balance sheet just doesn't look good enough. It just doesn't happen. So if they wanted to lend, they would, but they're not lending. So you have to look at why these banks are not lending. And that is a completely different discussion.
Yeah, I think that's the key takeaway. I just wanted to double click on there for the listeners. Yes, the central banks can be printing a lot of money, but if those reserves are just sitting on banks' balance sheet, it's very difficult to actually see CPI, consumer price inflation from that. But again, I think you're going to dive into the 1800s and start talking about credit creation, because we have some similar but a little bit of opposing thoughts here on credit creation. So talk to us a little bit about the 1800s and why you think we do need so much credit creation for a functioning economy.
Yeah, if you look back at the 1800s, free banking, there was the wildcat era where there was unlimited amounts of banks popping up. Credit creation was actually through the roof. But as we talked about in the interview that me, you, and George did, if you look at the statistics, the amount of dollars being created in the 18 to 1900s was drastically, like a wild percent more than it is today. So why didn't we, and during that time, we had consumer price deflation. So dollars, there was tons of them being created, but those were being lent into productive uses. And that was actually bringing the price of goods and services down. And real GDP during that time is the highest we have ever seen in the United States history. So when you're trying to say that money creation is bad and it causes inflation, how would this 100-year time frame ever prove that? I mean, it proves the exact opposite. And then people say, oh, well, yeah, the 18 to 1900s, that's fine. That was before the Federal Reserve. And we all know the Federal Reserve is in control of the entire world. But that is not the case, because if you continue this time frame and just blocking off spots of time and trying to figure out what is the correlation between real economic prosperity, how much prosperity does each individual have? And it continuously goes down. And why is that? And the answer that me and George have come to is that it has nothing to do with the Fed. It has nothing to do with credit creation. It has to do with government spending as a percentage of GDP. The bigger the government gets, the worse the economy is overall. And during the 1800s, we had a very, very small government, and it has only gotten progressively bigger.
To add a little bit of color about that, when I was in that debate with George and Josh just last week, I was a little bit surprised to see that there was a period of time in the 1800s where I believe money supply growth was something like 500%, Josh, and inflation was something like negative 60%.
Yeah, it was 6, I think, negative 6%. So that would mean that and the money supply is up by whatever 100%, and you are paying less for goods and services after a period of time, and your incomes have gone up. I mean, that is real economic prosperity during that time.
Yeah, so some of the statistics like that really do make me kind of scratch my head a little bit and say, hang on a minute, maybe there are some other contributing factors that are influencing inflation. So Josh kind of teased it out a little bit. We actually think it has a little bit more to do with the size of government. So we obviously both agree with that, and George as well. I'm pretty sure we can speak for George when George would say he does not like a big government. So let's dive into that next topic and talk about how a government spending as a percentage of GDP can potentially impact consumer price inflation and real GDP.
Well, I mean, I'm sure everyone knows it's just gone straight up. The governments have got more power, and that comes with regulation as well as deficit spending and just all the nonsense that we see. And the Bitcoiners and the Austrians are fantastic at pointing out all the problems with the government, which they are just mainly the main problem in everything. The Fed is in control of nothing. And I would think, at least for the U.S. economy, it is mainly the government that has had the bad kind of inflation where you're paying more for your goods and services that nobody wants to. But this was the main topic of the debate that me, you, and George went over, is how is it possible that Bitcoin is going to limit the size of government? Because if it could, then absolutely it would be a great thing. So Luke, what's your response there?
Yeah, so I think in that discussion, George was highlighting to the fact that before 1900, government spending as a percentage of GDP was something very low, like 2 to 5%. But then all of a sudden in the 1900s, we've seen the government grow to be as large as 20 to 30% of the entire size of the economy. And like we all agree on, government is very inefficient at spending, and government spending as a percentage of GDP does seem to correlate a little bit more with CPI inflation. Again, I might chuck a couple of charts that kind of back up that point up on screen so you guys can check out. But yeah, so I personally believe that Bitcoin is going to actually shrink the size of government moving forward into the future. And I think that Bitcoin combined with the internet will actually enable the rise of the digital nomad, which I hope and I really do expect will place some different incentives around the government. So if in California, for example, California just lost 300,000 citizens in 2021 because people got sick of the tyrannical nonsense being pushed by Gavin Newsom in California. And these 300,000 people are moving to jurisdictions all around the world, like here in El Salvador, where they can pay 0% taxes on their Bitcoin. And they met with a government who's a little bit less tyrannical and authoritarian than what you see in California, especially what you see in terms of the health mandates and suggestions being rolled out there in the US. So that would be my argument against how does Bitcoin actually help fix that issue of a big government. Josh, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, you could also make that argument. Why would any of these freedom lovers, especially in Texas, why would they allow lockdowns? Because you got the guns, right? Well, why don't you guys just move? Well, no one did move. And why is that? It's very difficult for your average person just to pack up everything and move to El Salvador or Dubai or Puerto Rico where there's zero taxes. And how many people have the ability to actually do that and where they could actually still have a job? So I do think that Bitcoin could bring down the income tax because it would be much harder to tax that. But why? I mean, if you wanted government spending to continue to go up, you could have the sales tax just through the roof. Let's say a 20% sales tax, very low income tax, because it would be hard to track. Mm-hmm. And I think that would still have government spending as a high percentage of GDP on a Bitcoin type standard.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. And I think we are going to watch a competition between governments and nation states around the world over the next decade or two. I think that they're going to compete with each other and try to lower their taxes to zero. But obviously, who knows how that is going to play out.
Why don't we see that today, though? Because, I mean, you see it in very rare cases, Puerto Rico, Dubai, but you don't see that in the aggregate total. Because when do governments ever choose to have less money and less power? I mean, just look at history.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be a little bit, maybe a multi-decade kind of process. And I actually think 2020 marked the inflection point where for the first time in 5,000 years, we are now trending more towards decentralization. So even in California and New York for the past couple of years, we've seen these interstate migrations just start to happen. I think people really need to have it right in their face. They need to have the tyranny on their doorstep before they will be forced to take action and actually move to a friendlier jurisdiction who will tax them less and will not lock them inside their home for 24 hours a day, like what was happening to me in Australia just 2 years ago. So I think people need to be pushed to their breaking limit. And I think over the next decade, as the government gets more bankrupt, they're going to become more tyrannical. So I think we're in the early stages of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. But that kind of takes us to the digital nomad. What Luke's doing, what I kind of do, but I not really. But what you're saying is, okay, tyrannical government. What we're going to do is we're just going to pack up the family, and you know what? We're just going to move to El Salvador. That is very, very unlikely for the majority of people, and it is unrealistic for the majority of people. If you have a family and you guys are just going to pack up your whole house and move down to El Salvador, you're going to get here and be just, what the hell is going on? Because, I mean, it's a completely different culture shock. There's many things there's many pros and cons, but there's, especially South America, there's a lot of incompetency with regards to workers and just the speed of everything getting done. Americans are used to things getting done very quickly and efficiently, and that is not the way it works around the world. And if you've never been to these kinds of places and you plan on just packing up your bags and moving, I think that is one of the dumbest things you could possibly do. But if you, let's say, check out El Salvador for a few weeks, hanging out with some buddies, and you find out that you absolutely love it, then it makes more sense to plan that out as a plan B. But what do you think? Do you think anyone should just pack up their bags and just move somewhere without ever spending the slightest bit of time?
I think you make a really good point. First, you want to go on holiday. So before you even think about leaving the US and renouncing your citizenship, go to Latin America and travel around. Spend 2 to 3 weeks in each country, kind of dip your toes into the pool, so to say, and experience the culture and ask yourself, okay, could I live here permanently full time? Don't just check out the touristy areas, check out the whole country and, get a feel of what's going on in the culture. And I think you also made a good point. I actually don't think the large majority of citizens and individuals will be able to make really drastic moves. But I think if the top 1 to 2% of the richest people in each country begin to make moves in large numbers, I think that could potentially put enough pressure on the government, because the richest people in each country or state in the US, they actually pay the majority of the taxes. So I think for California, for example, the top 1% of earners in Cali, they pay around 50% of all the taxes the government brings in. So I agree with you, Josh, that the everyday pleb probably won't be packing up their house and their entire life in the US and moving to sunny little El Salvador. But I think if it is the richest people who have the higher ability to move, they are the ones who probably are more predisposed to wanting to move. So I think if they do start to move in droves over the next few years, it could be very interesting. But Josh, actually, what would it take for you to leave Boston? So obviously you're only 20 right now, so you're a little bit of a young gun in the macro space, if I do say so myself. And you've already nearly traveled to as many countries as myself, but you've only really done it from a tourist standpoint. So what would it take for you to leave sunny little Boston, where you're living right now, to say
cold and snowy? You mean?
Not very sunny in Boston. What would it take for you to leave Boston full time and actually live in a Colombia or a Latin American country?
Just about nothing. I mean, I was living in Arizona for a while with George, and I do plan on moving to Medellin. Absolutely beautiful. I do prefer that much over El Salvador. Not just it's much cheaper. I like the culture there more, the people, the scenery, the food. I just think I just prefer Medellin in pretty much all ways. But I mean, there's really nothing stopping me right now. I'm just in a good schedule back home where I don't have to think about anything. I can train, work, and just do it all over again. So me and Luke actually were talking about getting a place down in Medellin ourselves. So it won't take me much at all.
You could be seeing some content coming out in the not too distant future. If Josh and myself are sharing a Airbnb in Colombia, we could be making some pretty interesting videos doing all sorts of shit. So stay tuned to that. But maybe before we close this one out, Josh, you can tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do.
I work for George and a lot of people in the macro space kind of behind the scenes, just doing some side hustles for them. So you can check me out at Macro After Dark, where we talk about economics for the more social side, which I almost prefer talking to some philosophy on confirming your biases. Thank you.
Yeah, well, there you go. That is the first in-person debate here on the CoinBeast channel. If you guys enjoyed that video, feel free to slap a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know what you thought about it in the comments
below. Make sure you stand up for freedom, liberty,
yeah.
Free market capitalism.